Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the webinar. My name is Cynthia Thaler, and I'm a policy analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Before turning to the content of the webinar, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housekeeping items about how the webinar is going to work, and then take a brief moment to tell you about the CSG Justice Center. Anytime during this webinar, you may ask a question by typing it into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. We will keep a running list of the content-related questions that we receive, and we'll ask the panelists to respond to the questions during the last segment of the webinar. We'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible. If you encounter technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues you may not be able to resolve, and for this reason, we're recording this event and we'll post it on our website. We should have the webinar recording as well as a PDF of the slides posted online early next week. The Council of State Governments Justice Center is a national nonprofit that serves policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels from all branches of government. And we provide practical, nonpartisan advice and consensus-driven strategies informed by available evidence to increase public safety and strengthen communities. The Second Chance Act, which was signed into law in 2008, is the first federal legislation passed by Congress to authorize federal support for reentry programs. In 2009, following a competitive process, the CSG Justice Center was selected to launch the National Reentry Resource Center and provide training and technical assistance to all Second Chance Act grantees. The National Reentry Resource Center is administered by the Council of State Governments Justice Center in partnership with the Bureau of Justice Assistance. The Justice Center is constantly adding new content and resources to our website, and we send out a monthly newsletter that provides information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. To sign up for our newsletter, please visit csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. On today's webinar, we will be discussing strategies for using data to identify racial and ethnic disparities in the juvenile and criminal justice systems, determine the best course of action to address those disparities, and track progress toward disparity reduction goals. We have a really exciting group of panelists with us today who I will introduce shortly. But first, I'd like to just give a quick overview of the webinar. So first, you'll hear from James Bell, the founder and executive director of the Burns Institute, and he will discuss a framework and elements that a jurisdiction should have in place to effectively collect and analyze data to identify disparities and use this information to change policy and practice. We will then hear from Kevin Williams in Pierce County, Washington, about how Pierce County used this framework to engage in this work in practice and how they engage stakeholders in this process of policy and practice change. And finally, we'll have at least 20 minutes at the end of the webinar to address any questions that you may have for today's presenters. We encourage you again to type any questions into the box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen at any time throughout the webinar. So let me tell you a bit about our distinguished presenters today. James Bell is the founder and executive director of the W. Haywood Burns Institute. The Burns Institute has worked in over 200 counties in 23 states to engage justice stakeholders and communities across the country to build equity in the administration of justice. Mr. Bell has assisted the African National Congress in the administration of the juvenile justice system in South Africa and consulted with the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. He has also worked on the human rights of children and restorative justice practices internationally. Kevin Williams joins us from Pierce County, Washington, where he's the probation manager at Pierce County Juvenile Court. Prior to joining the juvenile court in 2000, he was a case manager for a youth advocacy program and group leader at a group home for dependent and adjudicated youth. Mr. Williams had the opportunity to participate in the Applied Leadership Network with the Annie E. Casey Foundation in 2012 to 2013, and he graduated from Gonzaga University with a Bachelor of Arts degree in Criminal Justice and Sociology. Thank you to both of our presenters for participating on today's webinar. And with that, I will hand it over to James Bell. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, depending upon where you are. It's a pleasure to join Kevin in giving this presentation about using data to engage the issue of racial and ethnic disparities in the justice system. What I would like to do is set a framework and about how this works nationally in the jurisdictions that we've encountered, and then turn it over to Kevin to talk about how that framework then worked in a particular county, Pierce County in Washington State. So currently, where we are as we sit here near the end of 2016 in site work is that there's a tremendous amount of foundation work that is driving site-based engagements around equity, racial and ethnic disparities, ancestry in sites. We have Reclaiming Futures doing work in drug courts. We have the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation doing work on the youth side and what used to be called Models for Change and is currently now on the adult side looking at pretrial confinement in the safety and justice challenge work. We have the Annie E. Casey Foundation doing work in sites that are JDAI, and they're doing work on corrections as well as detention. So we have a lot of site-based work, and I'm sure that there are others that I haven't named, but in the interest of time, I think people get the point, is that there's a lot of national foundation work in the youth justice and the adult criminal justice system that is engaged in disparities. And what we are finding after these initiatives have been going on is that there is, once sites sign up to do this work, initially the population in detention or corrections does a drop, but disparities increase. And so people are doing work that they consider to be reform or analysis work, and then they see their overall numbers drop, but their racial and ethnic disparities can sometimes increase, which leads to fatigue and frustration in many sites, and sometimes in the sites that suffer from fatigue, the idea that nothing works. Which then leads to the search for some magic intervention. And currently, the intervention that seems to be the one of choice is implicit bias. People set up more what we call boutique courts, or courts like Veterans Court, Truancy Court, Girls Court, Drug Court, in search of something that will solve it by just putting in one innovation. And in some cases, sites that aren't frustrated are ready to go deeper by establishing a culture of inquiry in those sites. And Kevin and his colleagues in Pierce are one such site. And then one of the things that those sites that go deeper get into is probation violations, alternatives, and clearly these are things, parole violations, those kinds of things will be in play for the reentry population. So common challenges in data analysis and collection is, one is that sometimes jurisdictions get data reports that are extensive, but that data does not actually disaggregate by race nor ethnicity. And in many places across the country, we are having issues with disaggregating Latinos and also disaggregating folk that are tribes, Native, if you're in Indian country, or sometimes people in the African diaspora. So many sites are not prepared in terms of disaggregating by race or ethnicity. So the first thing is to be able to do that. Some sites are data rich but analysis poor. Even if they do have the ability to disaggregate by race and ethnicity, they get a lot of data from whoever it is that gets the data, but they really have no way to analyze it. It's nobody's job, it's nobody's position, so they have a bunch of data that sends them all different kind of ways, but isn't used in a strategic way. And then that leads to data overload, where we can collect stuff, but it's not internalized by the decision makers. So therefore, the data is really in service of not much. I'm moving on to how data is used oftentimes in the justice sector in various counties, because justice is administered at the county level in most places. People will use data for a grant application, to report to the federal or state authorities. Sometimes academics will come in to test a hypothesis and want to work with probation to look at that data. And so those are uses for data that actually are not going to drive decision making, because the way the data should be used, if you're going to be using it for those other things that we've talked about that the lines are through, the best use of data in terms of racial and ethnic disparities is to inform and drive department policy, so that you're using the data to actually understand your system, define and refine where it is that you feel your disparities are most. And that doesn't mean that because you have high disparities there that there's necessarily something that is wrong, but it certainly may lead you to examine why this practice has an impact on people of color or whoever it is that you are seeing are being disparately impacted by the data you're gathering. Helps you establish goals and to select effective strategies to deal with those goals and to track progress. So those are the kinds of uses for data that are going to bear fruit when you're talking about racial and ethnic disparities, and Kevin will talk about how that's landed on them in a particular jurisdiction. And this is what we do in all of the jurisdictions, most of them that we have worked in across the country. And so what we are going to propose to do is that the local jurisdiction decide, a lot of times with some help, what it is that they want to focus on. So they pick a point in their continuum, in the justice apparatus continuum. And so one could be, what is the percentage of youth population or any population that's eligible for detention or is going to be in this system? You could look at arrest. You could look at referrals. You could check on, you could see who's arrested and who's referred and how many people are actually admitted. In a reentry setting, you could set up where it is in the continuum you want to measure. And so here are just some examples of things that we as a collective would decide that we want to measure. Risk score, length of stay, whatever your criteria is that you arrive upon jointly that you think is going to help you identify your disparities. So this is important decisions to make. And you need to pick 1, 2, or 3 of these because you don't want to be overloaded with data and you don't want to put too much pressure on your system such that you can't get anything forever, and so you just sit around twiddling your thumbs because you can't get the perfect amount of data. We don't want the perfect to get in the way of the good. And then once we have that decision point or that place that we're going to measure, then we're going to disaggregate that by what we at Burns have called REGO, and which a lot of sites use around the country. And that is, we're going to disaggregate by race, ethnicity, gender, geography, and offense. And if you want to add some other things to disaggregate by all means you should do that. But oftentimes this is a heavy lift for most justice sector people people because they don't gather data in this way. Traditionally, they gather data by person, property, or felony misdemeanor. And so when we say disaggregate by geography and offense, we want to know zip code or police district, whatever it is, so that we can locate where people are that are populating the justice system come from. And by offense, we want to actually know the penal code offense. We don't just want to know felony and misdemeanor. We want to know what actually are the law violations that people are participating in. And so essentially, once we have that, then this is the process that we use. We identify those disparities because we've looked at a particular decision point by regio, by race, ethnicity, gender, geography, and offense, and we identify whether and to what extent racial and ethnic disparities exist. Now, when I say we, that's because we have a collaborative of people, the district attorney, the public defender, the judge, probation. We have those folks sitting around the table analyzing this data and drawing conclusions from it. And also, in many sites, we have, once we know the area codes or the zip codes where people are coming from, then we want people from those communities at the table to give a qualitative sense of what they're seeing from the data. So you identify the disparities, and then you identify a target population, because your data may reveal disparities in like 3 or 4 categories, and oftentimes it's too hard, and Kevin can speak to this when he talks about how it landed on the ground for them in Pierce. Oftentimes it's too much, it's too heavy a lift for jurisdictions to work on several types of populations, like your length of stay, or if it is that people are coming back for reentry, that there are certain maybe drug or alcohol or substance abuse offenses that you find people are having a harder time struggling with, or people who can't get a job or whatever. But if you try to do way too many of these disparities, you will not be able to carry the load. So we identify through a strategic, thoughtful process which one of these areas we're going to work on, and then we dig deeper into that population, into the data. So oftentimes you may get to file-level data in order to tell you the kind of things you need, but you're going to get into that, and then you're going to come up with a policy or practice change that you believe will impact positively that target population. You'll adopt that policy change, then you'll put it in place, and then you'll measure it. And usually when we put a policy change in place, we don't try to do it wholesale. We measure it with 10, 15, 20 people to see how this is going to work, rather than do something big and broad and while we're figuring this out. And then we document the changes in the disparity and adjust accordingly. And this is an iterative, ongoing process. That's why we loop it around. You identify, you select the target population, then you put in a policy change and you measure their progress. And here are just some slides to show you kind of what that would look like. These are slides from actual sites. We have a rule that when we're presenting to people, we don't want to give more than 4 or 5 data slides, because people just they just can't handle it. Most people that aren't data geeks or, don't trust data or whatever. So you want each slide to tell a story. So here you can see that this slide is telling the story about what the decision points are like. So here, this is black and white, and Latino and others. In this jurisdiction, mostly Latino population, smaller black population, but the disparities get higher. So you can see the population is 8% black, 34% white. At arrest, though, 8 jumps to 17. White youth, 34% at arrest, down to 28. And you can see the numbers as you go on. Then when referred to court, it's 19%. At secure detention, it's 25. And then transferred to adult court is 33. So here are disparities. Now, what I'm saying is that then gives you the ability to ask questions. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong, but clearly these arrows are going higher for a small percentage of the population, and they're going lower for the larger percent. So this just begins the conversation and gives you a sense of seeing where disparities are. And moving along, This is another slide that we will do. What we will ask a site to do is give us disparities by offense. And as I said, it's not person, property, felony, misdemeanor. We want to know the actual rate. And you can see we've broken down in this jurisdiction by Native Americans, Latinos, whites, Asians, African Americans. And if you look, you can see that the largest columns here are probation violations, warrants, and court-ordered detention. You actually, which are all administrative, you actually don't get, you can see the much, much lower towers in terms of the crimes. The much lower columns have to do with actual assault or intent. And then you can see it goes right to violations of conditions of release, disorderly conduct. So the crimes that make us most afraid are a very small portion in terms of disparities in this jurisdiction than they are administrative of probation, warrant, and court-ordered detention. So this, depending on which one of these three that you think wants to be your target population, this leads you in different directions. And so I just wanted to show you that this, if we were going to pick probation violations, then we would dig deeper into that data and begin to ask questions about what do we want to know about the violations. And then my final slide is a slide that Kevin will go into deeper, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is basically a slide that tells you how you go from the large numbers to digging deeper, and this is a slide that we train on around the country, and what we thought would be helpful for jurisdictions is for one site that actually used this approach, and here that would be Pierce, to tell you guys how they incorporated this notion of going from 500 young people detained, 150 released with conditions, and 350 released outright. So how we end up with from 500 young people detained initially to 185 eligible for release, and how you would go through those numbers and populate these boxes so that you could actually work on a target population and engage in a way that maintains public safety and supports equity. And so with that, I'll turn it back over so that we can get to how Kevin did it in his site.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Bell, for sharing that insight with us. And now we'll turn to Mr. Williams to discuss his experience on the ground in Pierce County, Washington. Thank you, Mr. Williams.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. First, I'd like to thank the Council of State Government and Justice and Cynthia for providing us this opportunity to participate in the webinar. I'd like to thank James and the Burns Institute for their work and support over the years in juvenile justice, and particularly with us. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to participate with him on this webinar. While I get the privilege of being the designated leader to speak about the work in Pierce County, I would like to just thank our current and past leaders who've kind of set the stages, our judicial leaders who've created an environment here where we can be innovative and progressive. And finally, I'd like to thank our staff for all their commitment to young people and families as we reform our system. So just some context where Pierce County is at. So we're located in the state of Washington. We're on the west side of the mountains, about a half hour south of King County, which is Seattle. We're the second most populous county in the state. And you can see what our youth population is for young people ages 10 to 17. So in 2008, we had an opportunity to take a small team to Baltimore to participate in the Burns Institute training around data and digging deeper. A little background about us. In 2003, we officially became a Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative site, better known as JDAI. And like many JDAI sites, we were able to decrease our reliance on secure detention We were also able to decrease our average length of stay of young people being incarcerated, and we were able to do that safely. Our felony filings were dropping. Our commitments to our state institutions were dropping. James talked about it earlier, though. We went to that training because we were data rich, but we were analysis poor. We had a lot of data that we were able to access, but we tended to get overwhelmed by it and just, would get paralyzed and didn't know how to move it forward. So attending the training was really helpful for us because it gave us a framework. It also gave us confidence in moving forward and able to identify a target population. I got to be honest, we went to that training, though, and even when we walked away from it, we didn't think we really had a problem. Like I said before, we were feeling pretty good about our reform work because our population and numbers had decreased. What we soon found out, though, was that, and when we peeled that onion back, was that the disparities for young people of color, particularly in our jurisdiction, African-American youth, those disparities were ever present, and at many of the decision points, they were getting worse. Just some context around kind of how our system works. So, being a JDAI site, one of the 8 core strategies is to have objective admissions decisions. So we use a validated risk assessment here called the Detention Risk Assessment Instrument, also the DRAE. And essentially what we're looking at doing is ensuring that we have consistent decision-making going on when a young person is brought to our building. Typically, there's 3 ways a young person would be brought to our building. It could be from an arrest by law enforcement. It could be that they are turning themselves in if they have a warrant, or it could be that they were detained in court. So the Detention Risk Assessment Instrument is to ensure that we have fair and equitable decision-making going on. We're moving our biases and our bias with making decision. And ultimately, what we want to be doing is making sure that similarly situated youth are being treated the same every time. So the way our DRAE works is there's 4 sections on it. There's a current offense section, there's a prior offense history, and then there's aggregating and mitigating factors. The intake officer will administer this assessment when a young person comes in, and essentially it's going to give us a score of low, moderate, or high, and that's to your risk to reoffend while on pretrial or your risk to appear for future court hearings. In our jurisdiction, young people that are scored low or moderate are able to be released to their guardian or caregiver or parent and return for future court hearings. The high-risk youth are detained and have to see a judge within 24 hours of their arrest. So that's kind of some context on how our system works. All young people that enter our facility receive a detention risk assessment instrument. The other thing I'd say is that, I think it's important, and we were able to get to this understanding internally with our stakeholders, is that you have a definition for the purpose of detention. For us, our definition is kids that pose a public safety risk based on their current offense will be detained. Kids that are a high risk to reoffend while on pretrial release or are high risk to fail to appear for court hearings. That's who should be in detention. Everyone else we feel like should be in the community or in our alternative programs. So James talked about the blue box, and this is the framework that we were taught when we went to the training in Baltimore. And ultimately, I talked earlier about how this framework gave us confidence to assess data and come up with target populations. The analogy I give, though, and it still fits to this day for us, it's like when your mother or your grandmother gives you that recipe for your favorite family dish. This framework here has helped us over the years for so many things, and it can get us to a place where we want to identify how we want to work with young people. Before we went to that training, we didn't have that. We were lost. So I'm going to walk you through how we utilize this, this flow chart. So essentially, in 2009, you can see we had 2,881 young people brought to our building. So the top row just shows you a breakdown of how many kids were released with conditions. So that means they were released to their parent, and they had to return back to court for a future hearing. Then you looked at how many kids were detained, and then you had the other kids in the right corner that were straight released. So for this exercise, as we were trying to come up with a target population, and what we learned at the training is we wanted to focus in, obviously, on the kids that were detained. And remember, I talked to you about how we administer the detention risk assessment on all kids that come to our building. So the next row shows you of the 2,140 kids that were detained, how many of them scored high D-ray, and you see it was 479. For us, those kids meet that criteria. When I talked earlier about the purpose of detention or the reason for the definition of detention, those kids we would say should be in detention because they either pose a danger to the community immediately, have failure to appear history, or have violated or committed a new crime while on pretrial offense. The next middle section there, low moderate, you can see about 1,400 kids who were detained actually scored out low and moderate on their detention risk assessment instrument. And then the group on the right side, 262 kids were detained in court at a hearing. So again, for this exercise, we really wanted to focus in on those low moderate kids because by our standards, they don't meet the criteria to be in detention. So then the next question we asked is, how come they were in detention? So if you look to the far left, we asked the question, is it a federal law that says they need to be in detention? And you can see the answer there was no. Is it a state law? And no, we didn't see that. So essentially what we saw is those 1,300, almost 1,400 kids were detained because of a local policy. 735 of those kids were detained because of what we call a special detention category. So that means despite your risk level being low or moderate, you're detained because you have an active bench warrant, a custodial bench warrant for your arrest. You were detained because of a probation violation, or it could be that you have a warrant or hold in another jurisdiction or county or state. So that's a local policy that we decided on. And then the other local policy was the overrides. And you see that we had 664 kids there detained for overrides. The majority of those kids at the time was because when we called their parent, we did not get an answer. We couldn't locate them at the time of booking. Or we had another group of parents that were frustrated and said, you know, I hear that my son or daughter is eligible to go home, but I'm not able to take them at this time because I'm concerned about my safety, or I don't feel like they're really getting a lesson, so I'm not going to come pick them up. So again, that gave us a jump off because we were able to then say, you know, we need to look at our local policies and standards about how come these low and moderate high D-rate kids are staying in the building. The other decision we made was that we wanted to focus in on the probation violation kids because we felt like there was an opportunity to shift that. So essentially, the framework allowed us to kind of identify what, you know, at the time was the so-called low-hanging fruit. We chose probation violations because the disparate impact it had on African-American youth. In our county, African-American youth at the time made up about 11% of the population. However, they made up 35% of the kids that accounted for our probation violations. To us, that wasn't acceptable. You know, our hypothesis was that because these kids scored out as a low or moderate on that detention risk assessment instrument, that they could be better served in our alternative to detention programs. So essentially what we did was we set up the end goal or result that we wanted to reduce the admissions and bed nights for African-American youth that violate probation. The response that we had was we established a data committee. Again, at the time, in about 2009, we recognized that our reform efforts were top-heavy. A lot of our judicial, all the efforts were initiated by our judges, our local leaders at the time, but the frontline staff that were working directly with young people and families were detached from this reform effort. So we felt like we needed to kind of go backwards and get our staff more acquainted with the principles of JDAI, get them more familiar with our data, and see if they had ideas on how we could change our policies and practices. You know, from a leadership perspective, we strongly believe that the frontline staff are the experts, and they are going to have the ideas. we also realized that we could, change policy all we want as an admin or leadership team, but the folks on the ground are going to be the ones that adhere or don't adhere to the policy. So we really felt like we needed to have their voice at the table. So we established a data committee in 2009. It was voluntary. We just opened it up from our juvenile probation counselors from our intake and our field departments. We only had one ask. Our ask was that we use data and we analyze data to look at changing our policy and practices, and at the end of the day, we wanted to reduce the admissions and bed nights for African American youth. And I think that was important in looking back that we were open and transparent about that ask and that it was non-negotiable, because I don't think you could bring a group of folks together and unless you know what you want from them. So we were clear about that. So once we got the group together, and I think at the time we had about 18 to 20 folks volunteer, we started looking at data, and we analyzed specifically probation violation data. So we started to dig deeper on that. What we found out is of all the different reasons kids violated, the majority, over 50%, violated because of they failed to reside at an approved residence. So that's a condition of the probation where you have to reside at your home with your family. So what typically would happen was that a parent or caregiver would call the juvenile probation counselor and say, my son or daughter ran away from home last night and I don't know where they're at. And our local policy was that we had to issue a bench warrant within 24 hours. The other thing we learned about this group of kids that were violating probation is that the majority of them were on probation for a misdemeanor offense, and the majority of them had only had 1 or 2 violations for this type of behavior in the past. Some of them didn't even have a formal violation. So that was intriguing to us because, it wasn't like we had high-level felony kids on probation just running rampant in the streets and no one knew where they were at. These were low-level kids. The next thing the group did was they analyzed their own practices for issuing bench warrants. And even though we had that policy in place where you had to issue it within 24 hours, the group soon realized that they kind of were all over the board on how they issued warrants. So we did an exercise where we kind of had them walk through step-by-step their issue on how they would issue bench warrants, and we put sticky notes on a wall. And those sticky notes were all over the place because, again, it showed the group that everyone had different practices depending on how they viewed that young person and that family. And the group soon realized that, that they were practicing in disparate treatment of young people. The next thing the groups asked themselves was, is our current policy for issuing warrants aligned with the principles of JDAI? Specifically looking at you need to have a continuum of options and you need to use the least restrictive option. And the group soon, unanimously said, no, this is not in alignment with the principle of JDAI. In fact, this is just a one-size-fits-all approach. So the group formed 2 subgroups. One analyzed policy, the other analyzed practices. They came up with different proposals, and essentially in 2011, about 2 years later, they made formal recommendations to our Juvenile Court Executive Committee, which is comprised of 12 of our judges, and asked them to change our policy on how we issued bench warrants. And that was approved, and we were able to move forward. So this next chart or slide shows you what the actual change in policy was. So again, the old practice was that anytime a young person was gone from their home for 24 hours, we had to issue a custodial bench warrant. So the first thing the group wanted to do was make sure that we had an option of issuing either a custodial bench warrant or a non-custodial bench warrant. They also wanted to implement a policy that had a continuum of options. And we were surprised by this, but they wanted to come up with kind of a grid. And, we've debated forever back in the day, should we use a grid or not? There was some of us that felt like that would ensure consistency, but there was another group of us that felt like the grid would make us robotic in our decision-making. So we battled with that, but actually our staff said we prefer a grid because we think that it would ensure that we were consistent and it would outline our expectations pretty clearly. So what you see is the group categorized kids in 3 areas. We had a low response, and this was primarily for kids that were on probation for misdemeanor offenses and had a violation history for running away from home under 2 times. And then you see lower than that if they had 3 to 5 prior violations, they could issue a non-custodial bench warrant, but if they were detained, they would be released into our house arrest program, where the group above them were straight released to their parents. The moderate response, you could see based on current felony history and then prior violation, and essentially non-custodial bench warrant for the middle category kids, 0 to 2, but they would be placed into our alternative program on house arrest. And then you see if a kid was on for a felony, but they had 3 or more violations for running away, then we would issue a custodial bench warrant. And then obviously on the farther end of the continuum, we had our high response, and you can see that this is for kids that were on probation for a firearm, a felony against person, or a sex offense. And if they ran away, we kept the status quo on them, and we would issue the custodial bench warrant in 24 hours. So the next few slides that I'm going to talk about are going to just identify some of the results from our efforts with this project here. The thing I'd like to say, though, is that the results are just indicators that things are moving in the right direction. However, it doesn't mean that we've figured this thing out or solved this problem. You know, ultimately, our end game as leaders is that when we leave this system, the racial and ethnic disparities that currently exist will be eliminated. If we don't meet that goal, we'll be happy if we continue to make progress, but we will never have hit the ultimate goal, and that's what it is for us. So I just want to be clear about that. I don't want to come across like these results are that show that we have it figured out. They just are an indicator that things are moving in the right direction. So the first slide shows you probation violations for specifically African American youth. So you can see in 2007 when we started this up, we had 111 admissions into detention for probation violations for African American youth. It represented 35% of those. Presently, if you look at 2016, we've had 23 violations, and they represent 26%. If you go back to last year in 2015, there were 37 admissions for African American youth, and they made up 30%. If you look at the bed nights, you can see that, again, we've been able to have some success in decreasing the amount of time kids stay in detention if they're admitted for a probation violation. When we started this in 2007, the baseline, you can see about 1,465 bed nights. Compared to 2015, we're able to lower that to 542. So again, you know, one of the things we've done that's not a part of this presentation is we've established a lot of community alternative programs. So the kids are going into those programs safely rather than staying in detention for violating, for non-compliant behavior. Another way to look at it is the average length of stay, and you can see that we haven't had as much success there. While we have less kids coming in the building, we can see that those kids are staying a bit longer, so that's something we have to wrap our heads around and figure out. You can see 9.4 days when we started this. In 2015, we had a big jump to almost 14 days. And then, you know, this year we're still at about 10 days. If you look at overall African American admissions and bed nights just in general, and that just takes out probation violations, we've come up with what we call a DMC reduction plan. It has 6 strategies on it that are intentional to, again, getting to our end game, which is reducing the admissions and bed nights for African American kids. So since we've implemented that in 2009, just the probation violations was just one of the strategies. You can see, again, we've had some success. We've had about a 57% reduction in admissions into detention. And then the bed nights is not as powerful, but it's still indicating we're moving in the right direction. We've had a 33% reduction there. If you look at violations in general for all kids, again, what you can see is we've had a 72% reduction since we started things in 2007. So this is tracking those special detention kids. If you go back to that flow chart, the blue box, that local policy that said despite your D-ray score, you have to stay in the building because you have a warrant or you violated probation, etc. This is just tracking those kids, and again, you can see the decrease that we've had there, and this is just for all kids in general. And then the final data that I'll show you is just our average daily population in detention. You can kind of see some benchmarks there. In 2004 is when we officially started JDAI. In 2008 is when I think we started to get intentional. It's when we went to the Burns Institute training. We established, it was called the DMC reduction plan. Now we changed it to a racial and ethnic disparities reduction plan. But that's when we got good with data, or getting better with data, to kind of identify target populations. And what you've seen is that we've safely reduced our reliance on secure detention. When we started this thing, we had about 108 kids in the building. Last year, 26 kids in the building. Year to date, 22 kids in the building. And the one thing, the couple things I'd point out to you too is from 2012 to 2014, you can see that we felt like our reform efforts were starting to plateau, and that average daily population can show that a little bit. We were just stagnant on 31 kids in the building. The other interesting thing that happens in 2014 and last year, it's the first time that our average daily population for African American kids was higher than their white counterparts. So again, I show you these results, and there's indicating that things are going in the right direction, but then you have other indicators that the disparities are still getting bigger, particularly at different decision points. But again, we're happy, and I think this shows that you can, at a jurisdiction, use data intentionally, identify target populations, and analyze your policies and practices to make good reform change, and you can do it safely. We've had a 66% reduction in our felony filing petitions since 2000, and we've had a 70% reduction in the amount of kids that we commit to our state institution, which is the deepest end of the system. So these reform efforts we've been able to do those safely. And looking back, the one thing that I think we have missed the mark on was that we didn't frame the discussion around race and equity the right way. I think we should have came at it more from the historical point of view in the juvenile justice system. I think we should have attacked it more from structural and institutional racism exists, and this is a system that we've inherited over time, and in order to change that, we need to look within and try to turn that, but it's been existing for a long time. I think our approach was just like, hey, let's figure this thing out, and a lot of our staff were like, wait a minute, are you saying that we're racist or we don't believe in this? So I think, looking back, we could have framed the discussion a bit differently and not just around data. The other thing I think that we're working on as leaders, and you heard me talk about the results. The results are really important to us, and that's kind of, at the end of the day, what we're about as leaders. However, we missed the mark in balancing the need to appreciate our staff and making them feel connected and valued. And, one of the things a lot of our staff will say that's, something that we can improve on as leaders is having a better balance of that. So what we've done in the last 2 years is started up two work groups. One is the equity team, and one is our employee appreciation team. And essentially what we're trying to do is have these work groups for equity make sure that we're recognizing and bringing awareness on a systematic level around disparities, and provide training opportunities for our staff that's ongoing. It's not just a check-the-box thing that you do once a year. And the other thing that we started up was our employee appreciation team. Again, that's ensuring as an agency that we're making employees feel valued and connected and supported. So again, when I look back at some of the things we did in the past, this was missing. I think some of our results would be more powerful now if we would have done that in the past, but it is something that's present, and I think it's going to really help how we move forward with our reform efforts. So I just end things, one of the sayings that we have, and we learned this through our work with our applied leadership through the Casey Foundation, is oftentimes when we're doing the work, we're on the dance floor, but we, quite frequently try to provide a way to learn, manage, and improve, and get up on the balcony and just look at what's happening on that dance floor. So, some of the views that we've experienced is that, the BI framework was awesome because it gave us a direction in identifying target populations, so we can be really intentional about our work and what we wanted to accomplish. Successful collaboration with our staff was really important, but it was also really important to have successful collaboration with our judges, our prosecutors, and our defense attorney. They were a part of all of the work we've done from the beginning of JDI, but even when we started our data committee, they were a part of that. They didn't play a direct role as participating, but we would always debrief them and, you know, get a pulse on what they were thinking. So successful collaboration is key in accelerating your results. It also helps you build your bench. You know, from a leadership perspective, we are highly invested in developing the next generation of leaders here, so when we leave, things are strong and can continue to move forward. So that's where that collaboration is key. Again, I talked about it earlier, but undoing institutional and structural racism and eliminating disparities obviously is complex, challenging work and risky. I think we went into this thinking that everyone was aligned and had similar beliefs, and you realize that everyone is coming at it from a different angle. So I think trying to find alignment on that work is important, but also framing it in the right way so people understand what you're wanting from them. And then, like I said, you know, just trying to find that right balance of focusing on our results, but also making sure that staff are feeling supported and are healthy. So, yeah. Appreciate being able to participate in this webinar and sharing our experiences, and we'll turn it back over to Cynthia. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Williams. And we're really fortunate today to have such a distinguished panel of experts on the call with us, and we have the opportunity for the next 40 minutes to engage in Q&A with our presenters. And we received a lot of questions so far, and we'll try to get through as many as we can during this time. And I encourage folks to continue to type in questions into the chat box. So the first question that we'd like to tackle is there, for both of our presenters today, is there a national model list of race and ethnicity to use in a database? I've seen many different lists, and it makes us hesitant to make changes. So is there any best practice in this area around what folks should be collecting?
I'm not sure. Is that question meaning what kind of ethnicities and racial groupings that they should be using? It's not clear to me, but so let me just address that. There is no national way that you can do it. There is, some people take the census as a way in which they can approach it. But my suggestion would be is to do it based upon your community, and what you know is what the public service agencies are dealing with. If you have an Asian and a Pacific Islander community, if you have Samoans or Tongans in your group, or if you don't, if you have mostly Chinese folks, that you then begin to disaggregate based on that. If you're in Indian country and you're near Native Americans, you want to identify Native Americans, but you also want to go further and identify tribes. What tribal affiliation do they have? And so I think that, for example, if you're doing Latinos, it's very different when you're doing Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and Cubans than we have here on the West Coast with Nicaraguans, El Salvadorians, and Mexicanos. So I just think that you can be very smart and strategic about how you do that in a way that works for you. What you don't want to do is come up with categories with people that don't even exist in your community, or if they exist, they're such a small part of the human services fabric or service provision that you need. So my sense is that you don't go to some, master list. You actually look at who your populations are, and there are people that you can consult with. There are community agencies, there's alternatives, like Kevin mentioned. There are people in communities that run alternatives, that serve different communities, maybe not even in the justice sector, but that you can talk to in terms of how you disaggregate. And that then influences what Kevin also talked about, is translation. What kind of languages might your justice sector have to engage? So that would be my best advice, is don't come up with some gigantic grand list that, represents somebody from Uzbekistan when actually you don't have any Uzbeks around, but you look at who your human services people are dealing with. And a good clue for that is schools and health. The schools and the health usually serve populations before the justice sector does, and you can collaborate with them to see how they do it. And I think the health system is excellent at identifying, as are the school systems, different races and ethnicities in your community. And I'll leave it there.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question is also for both of our presenters. How are reductions in racial and ethnic disparities evaluated and monitored?
I'll defer to Kevin on that, and then I'll follow up.
For us, we've tried to do is not the traditional way. What I'd say is has been by percentages,
Right.
And you know, I think percentages are good, but there's some challenges with that, obviously. We've also, and we learned this from Burns, is we've incorporated like rate per thousand.
Yeah.
We've utilizing a risk ratio because that just gives you a different perspective. You know, so like for the percentage argument, you could have 200 kids in 2002 in your building, and 100 of those young people were African American, so 50%. Fast forward it to 2016, and you've lowered your detention population to 10, but you have 5 kids that are African American. It's still 50%. So, you know, chasing that percentage can get frustrating. So that's why I would think that using risk ratio, rate per thousand is good. But again, I think at the end of the day, you know, if you remove the metrics, what's really important is to focus on, are similarly situated youth being treated equally all the time? And, you know, what I can say about our system is that doesn't happen. So the end game for us is eliminating those gaps and those disparities that exist there. And the data is a way to get a pulse on, is that working or not?
Yeah, I think what Kevin says about rates and percentages, oftentimes people get lost in it, but what we do is talk to people about housing prices. You can have an average cost of a house, and you can have a median price of a house, and that kind of gives you a sense of the difference, because if you've got two $2 million houses on your block and two $20,000 houses on your block, it skews the average, whereas the median is probably going to tell you what you're really going to be paying when you go there. And it's the same thing with the data, is that you want to have a couple of measurements that give you a real sense of what the actual impact is on those communities where your disparities exist.
Great, thank you both. Thank you both. Our next question is for Mr. Williams. How did you engage staff in Pierce County in a way that did not make them feel like they were being blamed for the disparities that exist in the system?
You know, I think our approach at the time was, as leaders, was to own the gap that exists in our system, and that's what I talked about when our reform efforts were top-heavy. They were led by our judges, our administration, but a lot of us, and I was a juvenile probation counselor at the time, a lot of us didn't feel like we were really a part of the movement, understood what was happening. So I think we own that as leaders. That was our first way to say, we did a bad job of this 5 years ago. We need to get you all in the fold. So that was the first part of it. You know, we did use some of we had 3 ideations of the data committee. So the second and third time, I think we got a little bit better of giving them historical content and data on the juvenile justice system, and I think that was framed in a way where they didn't take it as a personal attack. It was more of, hey, we got this system issue going on here, and we all need to wrestle with it. I think the first time we rolled it out, and this is when we did the data committee in 2009, I think the way we rolled that out and just trying to say, like, we have these problems in our system and it's because of our policy and practice, I did think some people felt like we were attacking them a bit. So, you know, lesson learned, I think we needed to frame it differently. But again, on the other hand, us owning the fact that we needed to get them more a part of the mix, and we respected what they did and their feedback, and ultimately it was huge that that group pushed a policy change through as big as the one that happened, and I think that was really the proof in the pudding for them, where they said, okay, this is for real, we actually can impact some things. So yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
I would add to that is that in order to get to that level, one of the things that we talk about, and I can guarantee that Kevin will agree with, is that if you don't have political will to be able to say we want to engage line staff, or we are going to be humble enough to listen to people with different points of view on this that are actually doing the work, then you're never going to be able to do the kinds of things that he suggested, because people will just opt out. And so I think that it would be wrong to leave this session on data and not talk about political will, because at some point something's going to happen in the justice sector that's going to appear risky to somebody in a position of power. And if they just get paralyzed by any risk anywhere, then I think you're never going to get down to the level and make the kind of changes that we are suggesting here in this webinar.
Definitely.
Thank you. Yeah, and Mr. Williams, you talked a little bit about the engagement of stakeholders locally in Pierce County, and we have a couple of questions about the stakeholders that were engaged, including about researchers and statisticians. One of our participants asked whether those stakeholders included researchers and statisticians to actually assist with the analysis that you were doing. So curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, you know, at the time we had one person that was responsible for all of our data points and also analyzing. It was a dear friend of mine. Her name was Julie Grevstead. Julie passed away several years ago of cancer. So, you know, that was, you know, obviously losing a personal friend hurts, but, you know, the thing also that was a kind of a learning moment for us was we went dormant for a while with all of our data emphasis because we didn't have anyone here. So present day, again, learning from that experience, now we have a data team. We have 4 people that are a part of that. We have a strong partnership with our IT department that helps support things. But back in the day when we first started things, it was more of a mom and pop shop and very small. And, you know, there were some benefits to that because we were all just so passionate about the work, and there were some great things that came of that. But in terms of sustaining it, you know, you got to have some type of infrastructure set up to support the data efforts. So now, like I said, we have that. Part of our grant work that we're doing too, we have a strong partnership with University of Washington, so they're doing a lot of evaluation and research for us with our reform efforts and new programs starting up. But again, at the time, you know, I think that was a good thing about us. We really wanted to do better. We felt like because we were doing grant works, we were accountable for results to make our community and system better, so we just jumped in head first. But sometimes that's a fault of ours too. We could have slowed it down a little bit and maybe got a better team together.
We have not encountered, this is James, we have not encountered a county that had a statistician or a researcher in that way that the department had. If the department has somebody, they're writing grants. They are rarely going to do evaluations. They usually hire that out with somebody if they're fortunate enough to be near a university and they can get it for cheap, or if they're federal or other dollars that can come that way. But mostly, this data gathering in some counties, it's actually on index cards. I mean, the justice sector, rarely are they high-tech when it comes to this kind of stuff, and we have never seen statisticians. It's usually an IT person, somebody that gathers the data for probation, somebody gets assigned that task when they're going to participate in the effort, and they need a lot of help and coaching at first because they're often gathering data that they've never had to gather before in ways, and then have to show it and present it. And so we have never been in a place that can disaggregate in the way that Kevin's slides have done without having to help the capacity of the local people to gather that data. So in 200 counties, we have never encountered a county, and these are big counties as well, that have a statistician that can crunch the numbers in the way that we've shown today.
Thank you. And in sticking with the theme of stakeholders, one of our participants asks, how do you present or frame this data to the public during community outreach, knowing that there may be criticism of the disparities that exist?
Great question.
James, you want to tackle that one first, just based on your experience?
So the first thing is, anytime you do a community meeting, it has to be well thought out and well orchestrated. If you're like Kevin was saying, you're passionate and you're thinking that the community is going to be partners and that they see that you are well-meaning and have, that you're going to try to be transparent, we're going to tell you to slow down and caution you that you really need to ask yourself. I can think about Clark County in Las Vegas, different counties that we've been in, Pima County in Tucson, that when you have a community meeting, ask yourself, what is the purpose of the community meeting? What are you trying to report out? What is it that you're going to gain? At the end of this community meeting, are you asking them to join your data committee? Are you asking them to be a part of the process, so you want sign-ups as a result of this? Or is it you just want to give information and have them clap their hands and thank you for it? And so what you're trying to do with the community meeting, I think, determines that response. And obviously, you want to anticipate that people are going to be like, I'm sorry, look at these numbers. They're not good enough for us. You guys, I remember last week you did a sweep and all the Latinos were picked up. I mean, so you have to anticipate that that's the case. But the more you engage with community as a part of your alternatives, as a part of your process, they can be gigantic agents for you and ambassadors for you in the community. So my sense is the data, but when you pull together community and you want to present, you really need to think through what you're trying to do. And the best, most successful sites have communities jointly put on the presentation. So it's not just probation going out to a church or a rec center and showing data and trying to schmooze or explain it away, but you do it with community people because you decide jointly what it is that you want to achieve. And those are the ones that are most successful in our experience. Kevin, I don't know how you guys handled it in Pierce.
I totally agree with you, James. We fumbled around on that. We had bad meetings where we just didn't set it up the right way. I think currently we're getting better, but it takes time. It takes a long time. One of James's colleagues, Malachi Garza, I was at a conference recently with Malachi, and Malachi said, don't engage community until you have an idea of what you want. James just said that, right? But the analogy Malachi used was it's like inviting someone over for dinner, and you start cooking when they get there, and it takes 3 hours to get the dinner done, and they're just sitting around looking at you. So I think you need to have a purpose and an idea of what you want from them. I also think, from my lens, it's really underappreciated how folks have been marginalized for a long time and never had a voice. So if you're going to engage, my experience has shown, like, you just need to be patient and let folks get some things off their chest before you action planning and want things from them. So that's the thing.
Yeah, I can't say enough. If you're going to have community meeting and sharing of data and being transparent, a lot of planning is really required. And the better you can be if you partner with somebody from the community to help ambassador these meetings.
Thank you. And we have another question for both of our presenters. And Mr. Williams, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but the question is, what strategies do you use to ensure that the use of data is institutionalized within the local justice system beyond the initial effort and players?
So, the kind of the simple model that we use is learn, manage, improve. So once we get the data, we, identify a place that we want to attack. Then we analyze it from the lens of policy and practice change. If there are changes made, we're constantly reviewing the data quarterly, sometimes even on the new stuff monthly. And then, we never rest thinking that just because a policy change was made that's going to be the end-all, be-all. In fact, our experience has been one area might be working out well, but then another area is going to go dormant or go backwards. There's many doors into detention, so we're just constantly trying to review the data to see what's working and what's not and managing it. The other thing I'd say too, just like with working with community, I think you got to give your whether it's a program implementation or a policy or even a practice change, give it some time as well too. A lot of things that we've seen kick into effect have been a couple of years later, but also don't ignore it. Monitor it pretty regular, and I think that's what it is. But it's a long journey. There's no event tied to this. It's just doing it regularly.
And I would add that you hire towards it. That your new employees, when they get hired, if they come into a system that, like Kevin was there before, during, and now, and many of your employees will come in, if they come into a system that's data-driven and is looking at itself, they'll just think that's the way business is done. So I think you hire to it, and and in your interviews, you make sure that people understand that you're data-driven in that way. And as Kevin suggested, always include the people who are implementing the policy in decision-making. Some people aren't structured that way, maybe because of unions or other things, but it's going to go better when you inculcate folks. For example, probation officers, when Kevin said that they put up stickies on the wall and they found out that you got justice by who your probation officer was, what you want to do is make sure that they are a part of it and they begin to see that this wide discretion means that you're getting justice by person, and that actually leads to disparities. And so by having them in and being a part of the decision-making, that inculcates it as well. And a unit in their detention center where they had 109 people and now you have 22 people, that's a totally different kind of shift to work. If you work in a shift with a unit of 30 and you've got 32 kids in there, or you work in a unit of 30 and you've got 12 kids in there, it's a totally different work experience, and that is also ways in which you begin to get people involved in what you're doing. But to just send memos down and for directives to come down from on high is just not going to work over time.
Yeah, I would add one more thing. Realizing that your stakeholders are going to change, your leaders are going to change, your prosecutors, those type of things, yep. And having a process to onboard them yep. into the reform work. And James has kind of taught us this over the years too. It's really just about making that culture curious and making it the culture dictates things. But you just got to realize there's going to be a lot of shifts with judges and prosecutors and DAC, but having a formal process to make sure that they get educated on the history and where things are has helped things out.
Point. Thank you. This next question is for Mr. Williams. What, if anything, was the role of city leaders within the Pierce County reforms?
I don't know if I'm tracking the question all the way.
I think they mean, Kevin, city versus county, since the justice system is a county-based system.
Yeah, so we're a county-based system, so we didn't have a lot of city input.
Okay. Thank you. And this next question is actually a two-parter for both of you. The first is for Mr. Williams. Is your data available through a national platform for download? And then I think corollary to that, Mr. Bell, maybe you can speak to some of the relevant resources that are available on your website.
Sure. Kevin, I'm going to push us a little to go back to the previous question about the city. I want to make sure we didn't get a short shrift. Even though the justice sector is county, did you have to engage with the police departments from the city, or any of the alternatives might be run by city agencies?
Yes. A part of our onboarding when we started JDAI, we had a strong representation from our law enforcement, which was in Park City, some county, our prosecutors, our defense attorneys, our community organizations. So if you look at it from that lens, yes.
So our data, what we have on our website, obviously the data that we collect in sites is confidential because, you know, the sites, we don't gather data. If we were working with Pierce, we're not gathering data to put it out there. It's to work with them as a county. So those data are confidential, and when we do that together, actually we try to protect it from interests that people may try to get together for good reasons or bad reasons. And so that data is, but I will say that data is the freshest data in the country, because most data that goes to the feds or to the state is 1 to 2 years old. We gather data every quarter or every 6 months, and that data that we gather locally is the freshest. On our website, though, you can look at, we talk about the kind of data you should gather by category without populating it with specific data from a specific site. And we also have data about disparities. If you go on our website, you'll see a map, and we fill in the disparities in your county, in your state, and we tell you who's reported their data and who hasn't.
For us, not all of the data, but a majority of the key data is, you can find it at the Administrative Office of the Courts, their website, AOC. The other data is available on our website, and then if folks want some things that aren't available, they can contact me, and I'd be happy to work with them and share.
Thank you. Again, this next question is for both of our presenters. How is data on disparities affected by individuals of mixed races? So how do you track this information in your system?
Increasingly, that's a question. Go ahead, Kevin. You go.
Oh, go ahead, James.
No, after you.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I'm a mixed kid myself, proud of it. But the way our system works is you would have to select a racial category, black, white, Asian Pacific Islander, or Native American, and then the way our system works is we also have you select if you're Hispanic or non-Hispanic. So for me, I would always have a problem with that. I had this problem when I was in school when I was younger. I hate checking one box because I felt like I needed to appreciate both sides of my family, so I would struggle. I would have to select one of the boxes. I know over time and the way our population is working in the nation, there's a lot more mixed kids out there, so one of our systems, kids are able to identify multi-race, but for what we show out, we ask the majority of kids to self-select, and they have to do one or the other.
Increasingly across the country, as Kevin has stated, and this is going to be, there are 3,100 counties. This is basically going to be county by county. Increasingly, there is a sense in the justice sector that we need to have a biracial category, and different jurisdictions are dealing with it in different ways. But regardless of how they deal with it, the biracial, once they begin to identify it, what we have seen as we go around the country is that number is somewhere between 2 to 3% of the detention population in places that are beginning to collect that biracial data. But it's a county by county, and what I would encourage people to do is not look for the perfect silver bullet on it, is to talk to people, be smart about it, and just start doing it. I mean, that's how reform happens. That's how innovation happens. Somebody knows that it needs to be done, and you begin this, and you begin to pilot it. Do it for 2 months. See what happens. I mean, instead of saying, well, we're going to do this forever, just say for January and February 2017, let's have a biracial category and let's just monitor it. Let's try to do it smart and see what happens. So I would, once again, to encourage to not let the perfect get in the way of the good. There are ways in which you can approach this if you think that's an issue that is important where you are.
Thank you. Our next question is, do you have any suggestions or ideas for how health departments can collaborate and partner with the justice system to reduce racial and ethnic disparities? And I would also elaborate upon that to just ask about other service systems in generally, including the child welfare and education system.
Well, I'll go. That's a particularly sore question with me. I feel like the justice system is increasingly being the place of last resort for people with mental health and substance abuse problems, which I'm including in the health sector as behavioral health, and the schools are increasingly zero-tolerancing kids into the justice system as they become more and more school resource officers on campus. And so I think that the justice sector is increasingly being asked to solve more and more social problems, and they are not set up to do that. It's an adversarial system, even on the youth side, of which there's a district attorney, a public defender, and a probation officer, and they're about guilt or innocence. They can't keep your, they can't stop your drinking problem. But if you violate the law when you're drunk, they can deal with that, but they can't keep you from drinking. That's a social problem. And so I just think that that these other sectors, child welfare, we know with crossover youth, that a lot of them are in the justice sector. And I just think that that when we have these collaborations, we need those other sectors at the table. And increasingly, those other sectors, this is totally editorial on my part, have ceded their authority when it comes to troublesome people in those sectors to the justice sector. So you end up with judges telling therapists how long a young person is going to be on probation while they're getting cognitive behavioral therapy. And the judge doesn't know that, the therapist knows better, but we've ceded a lot of this to the justice sector. So I think the health, schools, and child welfare sector are huge players in how we can try to address this issue of disparities. And there's enough research and studies out there, which you can find on the resource page of our website, that makes this, that the studies have shown that this is true, that kids of color are criminalized in areas that other kids are getting medical treatment.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think health, child welfare, schools need to be at the table. I do agree with James. Unfortunately, the justice system can become a catch-all for other systems, so that at times can make things challenging, but the ambition should be to have folks at the table working together. I'd say, if that can't happen, don't stop the work, keep moving forward, and look at trying to identify ways in the future to get folks at the table. And then, our experience has been sometimes starting on a smaller project can be a little bit more realistic to have those systems at the table to do something meaningful. So yeah, the ambition's there, it should happen, but if it can't, keep the work moving forward and maybe start small and see where that heads.
Thank you. Our next question is, again, sort of a two-parter for both of you. The first is, how did you define success in Pierce County? And Mr. Williams, you addressed that a little bit in your presentation and talked about how your slides show progress in the right direction, but interested to hear more about how you would define ultimately success. And then given the variation in the structure and makeup of every criminal and juvenile justice system, like we talked about on this webinar, how can other participants on the line think about defining success in their own jurisdictions?
A good question. For us, what I'd say is it was a part of the collaborative around defining what success looked like. So, kind of a short-term intermediate was the admissions and bed nights and reducing their we were able to create an alignment on that for all our stakeholders, so that was good. and that's kind of where we were looking at. But, you know, ultimately, and I touched upon this earlier, as leaders, and I'm not speaking for everyone here at Pierce County now. I'm speaking for myself and my colleague, our director. You know, we've committed to, and this probably comes from some of the trainings from James, but until the disparities are eliminated, that, you know, that's the ultimate goal of success for us. And I think when you talk about that on the ground, again, similarly situated kids should be treated the same. And you can see it every day. It does not happen, and there's a long way to go. But that's kind of how we're defining success for us, is that the disparities are eliminated.
And I would add to that quickly that each community should have what we suggest in our trainings and in the work that we do with when we're working on the ground with different communities, is that you do a day-long or a half-day retreat with data to say what would success look like. So what Kevin and his colleagues did is on the data that they showed, they set what success would look like, and part of how they got there was this grid for probation violations or warrants. So when you pick a population, don't try to define success generally. Define success based on that population. So if we had 85 expulsions during this school year and we believe that those are damaging to the young people and their families and they're not getting education in our community, then why don't we say that we want to reduce expulsions and still keep the learning environment the same? And that is how you then, and how will we define success? And is it just numerical, or is it a better learning environment? And so any way that you do it, I think you should define success as a group. And what we suggest is people actually write it out, that you write out what the success looks like so that you can give it to people, as Kevin said, as new people come and old people go, that they know that this is what you're guiding for, and then you measure it. But to come with a wide thing about we want equity is just because people don't have a common definition of it, and by having this retreat is helpful. And the last thing I'll say about that is it's very difficult for jurisdictions to do it on their own without some kind of outside help or facilitation, because when powerful people say something, people who will defer, even if they don't agree. And an outsider can say, well, Judge, that's your opinion, but there are other opinions in the room. We got them anonymously, and here's what other people think, and that way they don't have to reveal themselves. So that's what I would say about defining success. It really needs to be intentional. It needs to be more specific than less, and it probably needs to be facilitated from the outside.
Excellent, thank you.
Real quick, too, I'd echo that.
Oh, yep. Jump in.
The outside technical assistance is really important. It gives a different perspective. It pushes you in a way that locally or internally you're not going to be able to do, and that's really benefited us quite a bit. So I would echo that outside influence is really important in terms of helping you define success and getting you to look at it a different way.
Great, thank you. And we have time for one more question, which I think is a perfect segue to one of the questions that we received from our participants, which is, can you elaborate on the trainings that can be provided to stakeholders, including law enforcement and the judicial system? So, Kevin, I'll ask you to speak to any trainings that were conducted with your staff in Pierce County relevant to this, and then, Mr. Bell, if you can speak to some of the trainings that might be available through the Burns Institute, I think that would be great for folks on the phone to hear.
A lot of our trainings came from our work doing different initiatives with the Casey Foundation and JDAI. We met the Burns Institute through that and had a lot of technical trainings with them, participated in some webinars. What we've always tried to do is not just offer those trainings for our staff internally, but open those up to folks in our community as well. And that's been really, really good, again, getting an outside perspective. Present date, what we're really interested in doing and looking at partnering with James in the future is work on community and navigating that. So I think it's important particularly in this day of age with how technology works, of just being able to let staff know that there are things out there available for them to just access, easy articles or webinars to participate in, but also opening that up to your other stakeholders internally at your court and then to your community as well too is really important. And kind of our experience of using our technical providers that help us with our work, how we learn with internally our staff and then our community as well too.
And I'll just end quickly because I know we're at time, is if the resource information, www.burnsinstitute.org, to just be in touch with us directly. If you want training, we have a series of training packages from none of them are going to be less than 3 hours then. I mean, we cannot do it in an hour. If you want 50 minutes, that's not us. And so they're usually from 3 hours to 2 days. And just be in touch with us, and we'll talk about you know, what we can do, and we can steer you to other people that have had trainings so that you could talk to them to see if they liked it or what they got out of it.
Excellent. Thank you again to both of our presenters. We really appreciated the time that you took to share your wisdom and experience with us today on this webinar. And thank you to our participants for all the great questions that we received and for attending today's webinar. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Bye. Take care. Great working with you, Kevin.
James, thanks so much, man. Great working with you.
Take care.